Welcome viewers, Dr. JWAU, theologist, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia, since 1994. We're in the life of Muhammad and the verified revelation structure of the people of the book. And I won't say we're unscathed, but we've made it safely to episode 19. The protection of the Islamic ideological narrative. Night conversations become quieter, not absent, quieter. Doors closed more carefully, voices lowered, and certain subjects stopped surviving daylight. In the previous episode, conscience itself began colliding against unresolved moral contradiction, as historical Islamic traditions increasingly strained against the prophetic moral witness carried among the people of the book. In this episode, another mechanism emerges naturally from that pressure: the protection of the Islamic ideological narrative itself. Because once moral fracture threatens inherited meaning, authoritative legitimacy, emotional stability, and collective identity simultaneously, preservation instinct rarely remains passive. It begins organizing. And at first, the process feels protective rather than deceptive. Explanations appear, contextual defenses emerge, historical reframing develops, and the Muslim learns how difficult material should be emotionally processed before examination fully finishes unfolding. And slowly the atmosphere itself begins separating acceptable questions from dangerous conclusions. And that mechanism becomes extraordinarily powerful because the Muslim no longer approaches the historical record naturally. The emotional outcome has already become psychologically important before the investigation concludes. For the Muslim, the pressure deepens there. A child marriage consummation tradition becomes normal for the time. Female captive appropriation traditions become misunderstood historical necessity. Execution narratives become justice. And conquest expansion becomes liberation. And eventually the Muslim quietly notices something important: that the Islamic ideological structure and history no longer merely interprets the evidence. It begins regulating what conclusions feel emotionally permissible. And that is where behavioural governance becomes interpretive governance, not through visible force alone, through emotional filtration. The Muslim unconsciously begins protecting inherited meaning, relational belonging, theological stability, identity continuity, and psychological equilibrium before unresolved examination has fully concluded. The room teaches caution there too: hesitation, a redirected conversation, a subtle warning disguised as concern. No shouting required. The nervous system already understands the cost. And that pattern appears repeatedly throughout authoritative history, especially once moral legitimacy itself becomes emotionally fused to the presentation of the structure. Because once the conclusion feels existentially necessary, contradictory evidence increasingly becomes something to survive rather than something to examine openly. Viewers, the Qur'an repeatedly reinforces obedience and protective allegiance structures surrounding the messenger and collective submission. Qur'an 49:1 reads, O you who have believed, do not put yourselves before Allah and His Messenger. And that reinforcement matters enormously now, because once preservation of authority becomes emotionally attached to preservation of truth itself, disagreement can begin feeling morally dangerous before verification has fully concluded. The psychological transition becomes subtle, very subtle. The Muslim still believes examination is occurring, but invisible boundaries have already formed around the outcomes, and they feel survivable emotionally, socially, and existentially. And once that invisible boundary stabilizes deeply enough, conscience itself begins negotiating with preservation instinct internally. And that is the fracture for the Muslim, not merely disagreement. Internal negotiation against truth and pressure itself. Yet, for the Muslim, beneath the protective atmosphere, the unresolved question still haunts and remains standing. Does Muhammad's Islamic ideology, revelation structure, and the history pertaining to it truly align morally and prophetically with the already established witness carried among the people of the book? Or has the Muslim brought a preservation of the narrative progressively and made it more important than unrestricted examination of the historical record itself? Well, viewers, that distinction remains critically important, because throughout biblical revelation structure, prophetic legitimacy remained accountable to open verification, moral continuity, covenant ethics, and tested witness. And the Bereans in Acts 17:11 were examples of how they examined claims against Scripture rather than emotionally filtering evidence through preservation instinct, inherent allegiance, authority pressure, or existential necessity. Because verified revelation survives scrutiny without requiring narrative protection systems, emotional filtration, interpretive containment, or behavioural conditioning to preserve allegiance from conscience collision. Viewers, when the atmosphere begins teaching people which conclusions feel safe before examination is complete, the structure has already begun governing the boundaries of thought itself. And such is the Islamic ideology of the Muslims. I'm Dr. J.W. Ayub. I'd ask you to like and subscribe to the channel to reveal its usefulness. Press the bell if you like the content. Comment to educate me or to share your thoughts for therapy. And share the video to help yourself, to help somebody else. In the next episode, we're moving into the Islamic ideological inherited shield, Because once protective narratives stabilise across generations, children increasingly inherit emotional defence mechanisms before they ever encounter the contradictions themselves. And I'll see you then.